Okay. I went through a phase where I consciously decided not to pay attention to listening to the news and those kinds of things in order to not be affected in a with negative energy coming through the media. But more recently I've felt I needed to have more of a sense of what's going on, particularly politically in my own country where things are going a bit strange and
a bit strange.
a bit strange. But I've also tried to balance the bad news I read about with positive things that are happening in the world. But my question, I suppose, is if I read about a dozen Jewish people being mowed down by a van outside the mosque on a Sunday morning or whatever, that really pulls me down to read that. And yet it can evoke some compassion in me and really connect with what it must feel like for the people around that involved. So if it's evoking some compassion and a sense of connection, is that a negative tendency or a positive tendency? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, what about is it just in relation to what happens in Israel, in relation to particular identification with a tribe? What about Gaza? It's the largest prison on the planet.
Well, I'm only using that as an example that came to my mind. Any event.
No, I know, I'm not holding you, but I'm just curious, you see?
Okay.
What if, because this is also work, a test, right?
Yeah.
The seeds, that they can be still in dormancy, the seeds that we carry. Of course, it's like all this, that may be something we inherited. We don't even like that in ourselves, but the seeds of nationalism, racism, sexism, and so forth, they kind of there, they might just surprise us, right? And especially it's surprising in the societies where this is completely suppressed and completely considered to be okay, right? Certain outbreak suddenly makes someone, oh my God, so that people feel this is unfair, utterly and entirely unfair. But for you as a spiritual minded being, as someone, you always need to turn this into the chance to see where things come from. And the only reason I ask you, is it only in relation to what happens there? Because, right, this is, of course, the social media, distorts the whole thing. I mean, I may just tongue-in-cheek say, well, that for every single event covered in Israel, 1,000 events uncovered what happens in Palestine, because it's inhumane attitude already accepted. People live in the conditions beyond conceivable, and this is accepted. In fact, it's a boring old news. It's been going on for so long that we became numb to it. We became numb to it. When something is, it's been going on, it's like, oh my God, I even sometimes hear, oh, those people, they're cousins, they can't live peacefully together. It can only come from extremely uninformed / insensitive mouth. Because someone is uninformed, doesn't know the situation, doesn't know history, doesn't know nothing, doesn't know specifics. You see? But where does it leave me? Which side do I take? You see? Maybe I was brought up to always take side of the oppressed. You see? Maybe I was brought up to always take side of the oppressor because it's safer. Maybe life taught me. I don't know. So your question here is question to yourself. What aspects in you this or that news, this or that exposure to something brings. It's of more relevance than, how some of us get very upset about something. Some of us get more upset when they hear, let's say, a president of the country said something than when, let's say, there is a gunman comes into the school and shoots down, like dozens of people dead. Because that is considered to be, it's awful, horrible. But my God, have you heard what the guy said again? It's more upsetting, So we get upset in so many different reasons because it's again, whatever triggers our thought construct. So what's the question then? Where do we go from here? Where do we take our inquiry?
Well, I'm very aware about the biased reporting of things, and it's very increasingly difficult to know what the truth of any situation is. I tend to respond as a human to humanitarian things that I happen to hear about, and might check them out if I can. But I just feel, these days, that it's wrong to just ignore it all and say, well, that's nothing I can do about, so it's better not to know. And so I don't know what the answer is for me, but somehow what you've been describing to us this morning is feeding into my questions and helping me to try and tease out what is a healthy lifestyle in terms of spiritual practice and what may not be. I don't have an answer right now, but that's one of the things that comes into me, that I can choose to address or not address the news or what's happening around. So it feels quite important to try and take some kind of stand on it, position on it. And as I say, I give quite a lot of time to reading about good things that are happening in the world, because that feels, in a way, more important, because that's where the patterns, the paradigm is changing, and that gives me hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why James Joyce's character says, the history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. Again, it takes us back to the being true to ourselves. And there is no way we can apply same measure to everyone. If someone is in a tender state, it's almost equal to the quarantine. One needs to be established in some form of equilibrium. There has to be some equilibrium so as to simply behold, being able to behold. And these polemics of how the goodness coexists with what is, in a more religious term, spoken of as evil, is as old as the world. Yeah. For example, have you been in St. Petersburg?
No.
Well, St. Petersburg is one of the most beautiful cities as an architectural landscape of the city goes. It's like Paris, few cities. It's like city as a sculpture.
Yes.
It's not chaotically, randomly built. It's conceived and executed with precision, harmony, beauty, where best of the best was employed, because that's how Peter the Great conceived the city. Has anyone been in St. Petersburg? Yeah? It's a beautiful city, no? It's almost like you everywhere you walk, it kind of already designed for you to experience this, from small streets and canals to the open areas, and beautiful city, because it was conceived as grand idea of a single man who had a lot of power and a lot of resources. And yet the history of the way St. Petersburg was built, in Russia it is spoken of simply built on the bones of peasants. You see? One of the most beautiful cities in the world. A work of art, sculpture. There are only few cities like that. Only few cities. Maybe Venice, Paris, maybe Manhattan, where this extraordinary feeling of, the genius of how architecture impacts us. And yet, in terms of what went into it, hundreds of thousands of people were dragged there on these compulsory works in inhumane conditions, because it was malaria and everything. It was dump. It's built on a mire in a marshland. It wasn't built like, the canals were conceived later. St. Petersburg is an emulation of several cities. Peter the Great, as a young man, studied and traveled in Europe, and especially Amsterdam and Venice impressed him. So he wanted to outdo both. What do we make out of that, you see? And this is a simple example, but you can see that throughout the history. Whilst a profound cathedral maybe were built in the name of, to praise the glory of God, the wealth that went into that came from places where people were thwarted.
Yes.
You see?
Built out of suffering.
Yeah, built out of. So this is the nightmarish part of the history, which is continuing, because we also reached a point in time when the history ended. The dawn of the social media is the end of history. You see? The end of history. Because the history has no chance to be interpreted. It is interpreted whilst it's being made. 9/11 is a prime example. It was filmed as it was happening. So as it was happening, it was filmed, transmitted. I'm not talking about underlying theories of what went into it, whether this was masterminded to completely take the whole world and create a justification for new geopolitical restructuring, because there need to be something grandiose more than just, bombing of the embassy in the respective country. Whether we believe or not into this or not, we know that the man who made the film in praise of the heroism got converted into the stories. Martin Scorsese, who shot the film about the heroes of the firemen, eventually took the side of the conspiracy theory that this was indeed masterminded, because there are too many facts to ignore. But where does that leaves us? You and me.
It's tempting just to ignore the whole lot and live like a hermit and not get involved.
Yes, it's tempting. It's tempting. Or there is another temptation, to create an alternative universe, to create alternative reality. It doesn't matter how small, insignificant, and whatever it may feel. But just like alternative universe is born out of a single little bubble, and then it replicates itself. This is another possibility. In other words, one can live in someone else's reality, or one can create one's own reality. And one way or the other. Well, it's a physical manifestation, but it comes from this, not this, but the kind of community can in fact be continuation of the same reality. Who said no? I'm just saying. Ability to create universe out of your own, it's a given right. Svatantrya, it's the property of Shiva. And your essence and my essence is Shiva. That's what we spoke about all this time. Even the power to conceal my own luminosity from myself is the power of Svatantrya, unlimited power, unlimited will. When we exercise that power, we can then, and only then, we can ignore what happens, because otherwise we live as ostrich with the head in the sand, pretending as if it's not happening, pretending that this is somehow passes us by, or we somehow know. The real alternative reality here, so the alternative answer, is when we create an alternative reality. An alternative reality comes from richness, exactly, of ourselves. We're birthing it out. Like each single individual, each and every one of you is capable of birthing a whole cosmos and live as that cosmos. Then you can simply behold all this justice or injustice. Behold it with that unwavering eye of awareness. You can see how your heart moves in waves and throbs. You can see how you can perceive injustice clearly. You can perceive lies, malice, cowardness. You can see this. You can recognize them for what they are. But this no longer thwarts you or takes you out of your own center. It's no longer knocks you off yourself. You simply recognize that. And you know that the act of recognition, this act of recognition, without the necessity for some form of punishment, for some form of justice that you want to bring, restores this justice. This very ancient, do not judge, that we will not be judged, has the profound meaning, because we don't know the law of karma to its depth. We don't know what is happening in this level of creation and how it manifests itself. So the best we can is to live life as rich and as full as we can. It's literally, if you will, an act of rebellion. It's really an act of rebellion. This is why I when people kind of, watch the couple of Pirates of the Caribbean, it's made by rebellious spirits, about rebellion, It's living with a compass that is broken. It's of no use. It's not pointing where everyone else should go. So, Shiva me timbers. Okay, so let's raise our pirate's flag and go for lunch. Okay?